In this episode, I want to share about who control the money. We all affected in this video. Because central bank around the world, they all doing the same thing. Enough said, let's start this story. Central banks are printing money all over the world right now. Given that we're taught from an early age that money is hard to come by, and that we should work hard for the rest of our lives to earn it, how can all this money suddenly appear? Did all this money appear out of thin air? Who is going to pay it back? What precisely does all of this mean? Additionally, I'll demonstrate the real causes of wealth inequality. It's important for people to know. This journey starts off simple enough, but by the end you'll start to see the insanity of what we're dealing with. If you watch this episode the entire way through, you should have a well-rounded idea of what's going on today. The government creates the first form of money, which is really outsourced to the Royal Mint of the central bank but is still under its authority. Physical money is available in two different forms, coins and paper money. This actual money takes up a very small portion of the economy, between 3 and 8% in various economies. This actual money is manufactured to meet private banks' obligations. Banks must make sure they have enough cash on hand to meet those obligations before you attempt to take money from an ATM. Take a $10 note as an example. It costs about 3 cents to print this note. So there are roughly $9.97 for creating that $10 note. This $9.97 revenue created by government is called senior rich. So, given that the government profits from coin printing and minting and can reduce taxation on the general public, you may be wondering why governments don't always print physical money. Politicians are the primary reason governments do not generate the majority of money. If the politician in charge could print money at will, there would be a massive conflict of interest because there would be a strong incentive to keep printing to fulfill campaign promises or fund programs. The more money that circulates, the less it is worth, and this is a critical point. The loss in the purchasing power of money over time is known as inflation, and when inflation gets out of hand, money becomes worthless. Some recent examples of runaway inflation include Argentina, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. For instance, if massive inflation occurs and the ordinary person has $1 million but that million only buys an apple, how much is $1 million actually worth? Here, we can see some Venezuelans using money to make handbags because it isn't worth anything anymore. You can think of money as a measuring stick of value that is highly elastic and can change depending on how much of it there is. You can see graphically how fast inflation can run away because you don't see it coming. As the inflation rate rises, people quickly lose faith in the currency. Since President Richard Nixon announced in 1971 that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed value, money has no longer been the measuring stick of value for thousands of years because the US dollar backs all other currencies as a reserve currency. Gold was sort of like a physical anchor keeping the money supply in check and governments accountable. Although politicians are supposedly unable to influence the creation of money, this is still happening, which may cause issues as we'll see later in the episode. Nixon's decision changed everything. In conclusion, only about 3 to 8% of money is produced by the government in the form of physical notes and coins. The revenue derived from that actual cash is sine rich. This income benefits both the government and the taxpayer because it lowers the government's debt and eases the burden on each individual taxpayer. Governments don't produce more of this income because of the risk of inflation brought on by political decisions. Next, let's discuss private banks and debt-based financing. In the majority of developed economies, the private banking sector creates a significant portion of the world's money supply, about 97% of it, digitally. Therefore, the majority of the world's wealth is privatized. After numerous early bank runs, which occur when depositors attempt to withdraw all of their money at once but the banks are unable to do so, banks persuaded lawmakers that they should be legally permitted to create more deposits than are actually available based on debt. This is how governments outsourced to the invention of digital money. The concept of using debt as money dates back much further than this. In 1704, the English Parliament passed the Promissory Notes Act, setting the stage for banks to become the world's creators of money. Take a good look at your screen. What you see is a promissory note in this case. It's a written promise to say that you'll pay back the $20 you borrowed under the law. This piece of paper was equivalent to $20 today. In the modern era, as you'll see, the entire global economy is based on these promises, so banks were free to create and destroy debt and money from themselves rented out at interest. Let's look at how it functions today. When you go to a bank to borrow money, that bank has the ability to create money every time they issue a loan. They do this through the double accounting system. For instance, if you buy a $500,000 house, the bank creates $500,000 in their account, and you have $500,000 in debt that is the promise to pay it back with interest. This $500,000 debt can enter the wider economic system because when you bought the house, it was already created. When you repay the loan, the debt and money disappear, but the bank's profit from the interest remains. The real estate and property markets are the largest tools for creating digital money because banks have decided that it's the safest yet most profitable form of creating debt because if you can't repay the loan, the banks can simply take your house in developed countries. But what about deposits? When you deposit money into a bank, you are no longer the legal owner of that money. Instead, the banks are able to lend out 90% of that money to someone else while keeping 10% of your deposits in reserve. That person can then deposit that money into another bank, which can then lend out another 90%. When banks hold your deposit, they have the option to gamble with it by investing in financial instruments like derivatives and securities, along with hedge funds, in order to generate higher returns. Most of the time, these instruments are essentially just bets on whether the price of an asset will increase or decrease, but when taken to the extreme, they can get ridiculous. But the issue today is that banks are using so many derivatives, sometimes stacked on top of one another with leverage multiplying factors, that nobody really knows how much money is invested in this gambling. Some estimates place the derivative market at over $1 quadrillion, which is 10 times the size of the global economy. When the economy is booming, everyone takes on debt in the form of bank loans and spends the money on things they normally couldn't afford, but this leads to economic growth. People eventually can't afford to take on more debt and can't pay it back, so banks stop lending and defaults begin, and the economy suffers. This is natural and has happened for centuries, but everything changed in 2008. The world didn't want to go through the pain of a downturn, and some analysts consider this to be the exact point at which the real economy died in 2008. Banks had become so large, intertwined, and integral to the supply of money that when they were about to collapse, governments had to use central banks to bail them out. Remember, banks create 97% of all money as debt, and if this can't be paid back, it can cause a systemic failure, with the risk of the entire global I'll talk more about the following chapter in an upcoming video. Remember to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of the story.